Joe Biden delivered full U.S. backing for Israel in person on a solidarity visit in which he blames Islamist militants for a deadly rocket strike on a Gaza hospital. The U.S. president also announces the resumption of urgent aid to the besieged Palestinian enclave. And on an Israel visit, UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak aims to ensure de-escalation. As per the Palestinian Health Ministry, 471 people killed in the hospital strike. Israel's denied responsibility, saying an initial investigation showed the strike was caused by a malfunctioning rocket fired by the Palestinian militant Islamic Jihad group. Like Hamas, Islamic Jihad is proscribed as a terrorist group by the United States and other Western governments. Arab countries have almost universally blamed Israel for the hospital strike, including Egypt, Jordan, the UAE, among the region's few nations that have diplomatic ties with Israel. Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi predicted the end of Israel following deadly Gaza hospital explosion. Apart from funding Hamas, Israel's archfoe backs Hezbollah in Lebanon. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation, a 57-member bloc of Muslim-majority countries, denounced Israel's backers for granting the country impunity in its war. Continuing the conveyor of Western leaders who have visited Israel in the wake of Hamas attacks, the British Prime Minister will be in Israel to seek de-escalation of the conflict. Rishi Sunak will then travel to West Asian capital as part of the diplomatic efforts. US President Joe Biden is also eyeing unprecedented aid for Israel and the Palestinians in Gaza and West Bank as part of a wider $100 billion package that includes support for Ukraine. Meanwhile, Chinese President Xi Jinping told Egypt's Prime Minister that Beijing hoped to work with Cairo to bring more stability to West Asia.
Are in the public gallery today of all hostages.
For more on this, we're now being joined by Principal Diplomatic Correspondent Siddhant Sibal. Also joining us on the show is Mr. Omar Barghouti, who is a prominent Palestinian human rights defender, a co-founder of the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions movement. Sir, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Thank you.
Siddhant, starting with you, what can you tell us of the situation on ground?
Well, today we will see the visit of the UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak to Israel. We know that in the past several world leaders, Western leaders have travelled to this country, including US President Joe Biden, extending a show of support to the Israeli government and people of Israel at a time when the country is dealing with the attack from Hamas. But essentially, they're also trying to nudge Israel to make sure that the humanitarian situation in Gaza does not worsen. So we know there's a lot of anger here in Israel, and that puts a lot of pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu to take action against Hamas hideouts in Gaza. But that leads to the wider humanitarian crisis in the region, which the UN has termed as catastrophe. So situation remains precarious, remains dynamic, and remains in a fluid kind of situation where, of course, anything can go wrong, or perhaps the focus remains on de-escalation of the ongoing crisis.
Right. Mr. Barghouti, coming to you now. Thank you so much for staying on with us. Sir, Joe Biden announced the resumption of aid to Gaza. To begin with, what can you tell us of the situation on ground? Also, I would like to thank you for joining us at such a tense time.
Well, it's not just a tense time, it's a time of genocide. Much of the world, including the Organization of Islamic Cooperation just last night, see what Israel is doing to Palestinians, cutting off water, food, electricity, and continuously indiscriminate bombardment and massacres, including at the hospital, the Baptist hospital in Gaza, killing hundreds of Palestinians, as war crimes that amount to the crime of genocide. Now the world, human rights organizations are realizing that this is genocidal. More than 800 international law and genocide studies scholars have said, we accuse Israel of committing genocidal acts. This has to be investigated. So it's not precarious, it's not tense, it's acts of genocide. That's what's happening on the ground, and it has to be framed that way. The second point is that from an ethical perspective, we've got to remember there is no violence without oppression. Oppression is the root cause of violence. If we like we in the BDS movement, a non-violent human rights movement, if you want to end all violence, let's start by addressing the root causes of violence. 75 years of settler colonialism and apartheid, that is the beginning of violence. So when Biden says he will send us some band-aids after being a partner in genocide, no less, this is beyond insult. This is beyond something that's unethical. He's just laughing at the whole world, vetoing a UN resolution that is so horrible, yet called for some break in some minimal break in the attacks, and he vetoed it. The whole world stands against the US administration in its extremely bloodthirsty position, including the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the Arab League, many in the Global South, China, increasingly Latin America, African states. And within the West, it's very important to point out, yesterday, Jewish Voice for Peace in the United States, 500 Jewish Americans occupied a building in Congress to call for stopping the genocide, ceasefire now, not in our name. A beautiful show of meaningful solidarity and showing that it's not us versus them as a tribal Muslims versus I don't know what. It's pro-liberation, pro-justice, pro-freedom, or those against liberation, against justice, against freedom.
All right, sir. Now, that being said, another major issue here that I want to point out, displacement of millions of Gazans, that's been an issue. What options do Gazans have, especially at a time when Egypt and Jordan are not willing to take in refugees, fearing the complete expulsion of Gazans? What do you have to say about that?
This is ethnic cleansing, as the UN Special Rapporteur said. This is ethnic cleansing, televised ethnic cleansing. It's not something that you read in the paper, you're watching it on TV. Israel has ordered the evacuation of 1.1 million. Hundreds of thousands cannot leave, possibly. And the United Nations said that it's impossible. It's a humanitarian catastrophe. That is ethnic cleansing. And some governments are standing by, supporting this, arming Israel while it's doing this. The UK, the US are extremely complicit in those acts of genocide. So is the EU and much of Europe. So it's very, very important at this point that India steps up and joins the rest of the Global South in taking a clear position. Now, the most profound moral obligation is to stop Israel's genocidal war, to stop the complicity. And silence is complicity. Equivocating between oppressor and oppressed is complicity.
All right. Siddhant, coming to you now, another thing that we've been discussing so far, and we discussed this yesterday as well, you got us voices from the families of those who've been taken hostage by Hamas. Where is the situation right now? Has there been any plan of action with regards to the hostage situation?
Well, the hostage situation is a worrisome situation here in Israel. Almost on a daily basis, we have seen protests by the family members of the people who have been kidnapped and kept as hostage by Hamas. And in this city, in Tel Aviv, we have seen pictures across the city posted on cars, on trees, anywhere you look at, and also yellow ribbons as a show of support to the family members of hostages. Yesterday we were at one of the protests and we saw people breaking down as well. But nonetheless, that puts a lot of pressure on Netanyahu government for an early release of the hostages. We know that the Israeli government has linked the release of the hostages with the humanitarian support. They have clearly said that when it comes to sending humanitarian support to Israel, from Israel to Gaza, that's not going to happen unless there is some movement on the release of the hostages. So that is something that is the top priority of the Israeli government, and the Israeli government is leaving no stone unturned to make sure that there is a release of hostage as soon as possible. But with each passing day, there is a hope that is diminishing and concerns increasing for the family members, and that is why they are getting anxious and they're calling on their government to make sure that some kind of action is taken for the release of their loved ones.
All right. Well, Siddhant, thank you so much for bringing us the latest on this from Israel. Also, Mr. Omar Barghouti, thank you so much for joining us on WION with all your insights and perspective on this. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.